Welcome to the second half of your lecture this week. This chapter, we're going to deal with the female offenders in our correctional systems. And with this lecture, we're going to understand that women offenders have several physiological as well as psychological characteristics that set them apart from their male counterparts. The characteristics that we're going to look at and center on are common to the population of females within the broader society. However, we're also going to look at other characteristics that are going to point out as unique to those female offenders that are in our system. Of the offending female population nationwide, only about 7% are women. And we saw those populations grow faster than men in the decade between 2000 and 2010. What this growth rate ensures is that the female population is going to be of increasing importance for the police, courts, and correction system for some time to come, and the major reason why we are talking about them in its own chapter. During this chapter, we are going to continue to discuss some of the characteristics of female offenders and compare these rates of incarceration in terms of the sentencing between male and female offenders. We're going to look at the history of corrections in relation to female offenders and describe some of the issues that are related to those male offenders in our modern-day correction system. We're going to identify some of the considerations associated with effective correctional operations when we look at female offenders, and also look at some of the legal issues that are involved when dealing with female offenders. Lastly, we're going to look at some of the various treatment implications when looking at female offenders behind bars. So let's get started in looking at female offenders in our correctional facilities, which is Chapter 11 in Introduction to Corrections. Well, in the introduction of this lecture, we talked about the fact that women incorporated about 7% of the total prison population. And while that was a result of a remarked increase over the years of 2000 to 2010, we have seen in recent years that there's been a slight downturn in female offender growth within the prison population. And while we don't know exactly what the reason for this is, we have inferred that it could be that there is a greater emphasis in the system of placing female offenders within treatment or community-based sanctions, which we talked about in an earlier lecture, or the possibility that we've had recent emphasis on offender reentry. And with these numbers, it's not that we have less females within the system itself, but less females within the prison system throughout the United States. They only number about 65 out of 100,000, or in total about 106,000 plus women within the entire system itself. The United States incarcerates more women than any other country in the world. And the most females that are housed in correctional systems throughout the United States are housed in just 3 states: Texas, Florida, and California. So while we continue to look at what exactly drives the female offender population, remember that while the numbers are small, they have clear and precise issues that we're going to talk about as far as the challenges that brings to our correctional system. Numbers across the United States as far as females within correctional facilities are kind of mixed. We've seen 20 states across the United States, as well as the Federal Bureau of Prisons, show decreases in their female prison populations by the end of 2016, which is our latest year for current statistics, with the largest decrease being actually Indiana, as well as Alabama. But increases in female prisoners have occurred in 26 states, with the largest increase being Kentucky, the state of Washington, as well as Ohio. The lowest rates of incarceration happen to be in the states of Rhode Island, Maine, Vermont, Minnesota, and New Hampshire. The states that are considered most progressive are also more prone to using treatment schemes, maybe restorative justice approaches, and other alternatives other than prison, which could account for why they show the lowest rates of incarceration. The federal system, well, they have their fair share of female prisoners, and those female prisoners rose slightly by the end of 2016. It's not considered to be all that significant, but it is still rising in proportion to that of the male offenders. Most of those in the federal system are there on federal drug-related offenses, over 55%. Another 15% are there on charges of fraud, and only 3% are there on immigration issues, which leads us to understand that almost 75% of female inmates within the federal system are there on non-violent crimes. Most of them have little or no prior history, and in the federal system at least, the average age for those sentenced within the federal prison system tends to be a little later in life, almost 40 years old. So those are just some of the statistics that we have as late as 2016, which is as close as we can get to the most current statistics, and leads us to understand just a glimpse of what some of the females within our systems look like. When we look at the history of women behind bars, we have to go prior to the 1800s. Now, if you recall, to look at the history of the incarceration or imprisonment period, what you have is that any imprisonment whatsoever put those that were charged with crimes together in just one room. There was no classification system. There was no separation of anybody back in the old days, and therefore women were generally imprisoned in the same facilities as men, a lot of times in the same rooms as men. And so even back into our English history, where women, children, and men were imprisoned together in either actual buildings or in floating jails on the Thames, what we have is looking back on the impact that John Howard had in drawing attention to the hazardous conditions of anybody who spent time in jails across the country of England, and what he tried to do to bring about changes to the jail system throughout England. The issue of women during that time, especially when we were developing prisons here in the United States and in Pennsylvania with William Penn and his great law, the issue of women inmates was actually addressed, and they were separated at this time. However, it doesn't mean that the living conditions was any better. In 1838, The New York City jail, one of the first of its kind, had one-person cells for 70 women. There were only 42 of them, you do the math. But when Auburn Prison in New York was in the 1920s, there were no separate cells for women. They were all lodged together in a one-room attic, and the windows were sealed so that they could not communicate with the men. Think about what kind of hazardous conditions could be had from a attic that had sealed windows for no ventilation to prevent communication. So now what we have is, even during that time, the prevalence of sexual abuse, which will be a continued topic throughout this chapter, was still a very common occurrence. So now what we're going to talk about is how the beginnings of reform in the person of one of the greatest female reformers for prison female inmates started, and her name is Elizabeth Fry. Elizabeth Fry was actually a Quaker reformist who lived during the 1800s. She advocated for women who were incarcerated, and although most of her work was done in England, because of her work, she became known around the world. She was one of the first persons in the United States and Europe to actually highlight what it was like to be a female offender. And being a Quaker, she was instrumental in affecting positive change in American prisons, as were all the Quakers, as we talked about in the history back in Chapter 1. Fry was also influential in being invited, and most women were not even acknowledged during this time, to share her thoughts across North America as well as Europe. And while she was explaining what she thought would be the right way for women to be treated in prison, she visited Old Newgate Prison in England, which was one of the original prisons and the one that the Newgate Prison in Connecticut was named after. Now, we remember from our earlier lectures on how prisons were operated in the very beginning, and the conditions were usually horrid. There was no sanitation. There was no medical care. Everybody was together. The vermin was overrunning. They had little food, no clothes. If you couldn't be paid for by your family, you never were fed. For female inmates, imagine that it was worse. Approximately 300 women and children were collectively housed in 2 large cells in Newgate Prison in England. So imagine, if you as a woman were sentenced to prison, you took your children with you. Imagine that. Cooking, going to the bathroom, sleeping, they were all done in the cell. No fresh linens were provided. No night clothes were available. And as a result, Elizabeth Fry convinced the people how horrid this was and brought them food, clothing, straw bedding. By 1817, she was able to organize the first group of women who could be advocates for the improvement of female prisoners. They created school curriculum for the female inmates so that they could learn to sew, knit, and do things that were expected of women during this time. It was for this that they were also bringing in religious studies, which was a common ground and what was expected of inmates and offenders during this time. And so it was due to her influential help that she was able to get some changes made to the way things went at Newgate. Now, one of the things that we need to understand as far as the work of Elizabeth Fry and what was going on was the society in which the work was being done and what was expected of women during this time period. Judges during the 1800s were hesitant to sentence women for serious crimes unless they were habitual offenders. This is known as the chivalry hypothesis, which really is saying that there is bias in the criminal justice system against giving women harsh punishments. The Victorian era was viewed through a lens of what they call inflexibility, where femininity was considered to be one of piousness and naivete to the evils of the world. Male-dominated for sure, and the criminal justice system tended to really downplay female crime, which was making it less likely to be detected, reported, prosecuted, or sentenced. The only time women really actually fell within the confines of the criminal justice system was if they fell outside of those expectations, in which time they would be considered abnormal and not women. And if at this time they committed serious crimes, then they were considered evil or abhorrent. If they fell into this category, then the chivalry hypothesis would not apply, and they would be sometimes sentenced to harsher punishments than even men because they did not conform and thereby didn't abide by the expectations of society during this era. And so a lot of times, if women were even considered to be violating the law, if they fit into that societal role, then the male-dominated courts really would not punish them. But if they didn't conform to that societal role, then they would be punished much more severely. And it's not something that is totally understood, but that chivalry hypothesis really went on well into the 20th century. And it hasn't been really within the last 60 years that we've started to abandon that chivalry hypothesis. As a result of the groundbreaking work of Elizabeth Fry, and of course the after effects of the Civil War, what we found is there were a couple of things that created much more prevalence of female criminality following the mid-1850s into post-Civil War era. For one thing, a lot of the men went off to war and to fight, and a lot of those men got killed as a result of the Civil War. We also saw, especially in the North, a lot of industrialization, and it created a lot of circumstances where the women, either as a result of men fighting the war and not coming home or coming back crippled, women became much more visible within society. As a result of the industrialization and the moving more towards cities to find jobs, this created an increase in crime throughout society. So that by the mid to late 19th century, there was an increase in female inmates. You just think how things kind of constructed themselves. You have a war that creates a decrease in men due to fighting and death. More women are having to take up the necessary responsibilities of running households, running families. Industrialization comes into the north and in sometimes the southern cities. Cities are growing. We're finding more urbanization as a result. We're finding more crimes. Immigration is starting to come into play, especially in the era of 1840 to about 1930. And so this period of time, we're finding more and more criminality, and that includes female criminals. And within that time, there were enough women inmates to necessitate and require separate women's quarters. We haven't gotten to the point where they require separate women's prisons, but by the mid-1850s, the mid-19th century, we started to realize that the separation of women from men in prisons facilities was going to become a necessity. It wasn't until the early 1870s that inspections of correctional facilities in Indiana, as it were, showed that the staff in female prisons actually were horrible, and that it needed to have female prisons that were completely separate from male prisons and that were staffed primarily by female officers. By 1940, just prior to World War II, 23 states, not all 50, but 23 states, had separate women's prisons. Once it became clear that we had to have more penitentiaries built, and that custodial prisons were going to be built for women, the first most common form of custodial confinement was going to be attached to male prisons. Most of the time, the women in these prisons were going to be convicted of felony charges. Most of the time, it was petty theft. Only about a third of female felons, were ever convicted of violent crimes. This standard holds true today. If you look at the percentages of female offenders and what they are sent to prison for, the percentages of females sent to prison for violent crimes is the fourth, below drug crimes, property crimes, public order offenses, and then violent crimes. And so it holds true, as it was 100 years ago, that women are sent most often to prison for something other than a violent crime. The reasons for women that commit crime, especially violent crime, are pretty different from those of male offenders. Most of the crimes of murder by women were adult men. And a lot of times these homicides were committed, normally were domestic in nature. Usually because of long-term spouse abuse, and what turned out to be a victim turned perpetrator. What we consider to be now battered woman syndrome. But at that time, it wasn't looked upon because of the way society's values looked upon the family structure. Women had no rights. Women had to endure what the head of the family said. And we'll continue to talk about this until we get into the modern era. And so if a woman was subjected to a rather abusive spouse or father, it was expected that she would take it. And so if it got to a point where she was charged with a violent crime, most notably murder, a lot of times it was going to be domestic in nature, due to the fact that she had, quote unquote, finally had enough and decided to take it out once she had been a victim enough and decided to kill the perpetrator. Murders of men, particularly adult men, likely resulted from the dynamics that were not acknowledged by the courtrooms of that time. So a woman who killed an adult man, whether it be a husband or a father, couldn't go into court like they could nowadays and say, but he abused me or he hit me. That was seen to be a male right of the time period. Other evidence does exist that the chivalry hypothesis that we talked about in previous slides may have been a partial explanation for the female criminality. Seeing that women who committed crimes were often immigrants who were seen as immoral menaces. And so therefore, because they were seen to be outside society's expectations, guess who were the ones sent to prison more often? And so that's how we start to see, and what we'll talk about in our next slide, the beginning of minority overrepresentation within our prison systems. Social views that were related to women and criminality were tied to very moralistic outlooks regarding sexuality and identities as mothers. And what that means is performing illegal abortions, and they weren't legal until the 70s, meant that you could be put in prison for having an abortion. And that meant that society's expectations at the times meant that if you were sexually abused or assaulted, society expected you to endure and take care of that child if you became pregnant. But on the other side, you would then be a moral outcast. So the way our criminal justice system operated as far as women were concerned back in the early 20th century and the late 19th century was how women were perceived and how women were expected to act. And if they didn't act within those confines, that was how they would be treated within the criminal justice system and how they would ultimately end up in prison. As I mentioned in an earlier slide, the time within our history between 1840 and 1920, we saw a huge influx of immigrants come to our country. During that time, we also saw the Civil War. We saw the emancipation of our enslaved population. And we also saw many of our fighting men not return from either side of the war. During this time, we also saw the ways that our female offenders were expected to be treated. What we also must understand is that racial disparities within our correctional facilities and between our offender population, male or female, have existed and continue to exist, especially within the female population, since the beginning of our incarceration philosophy. Prison camps that emerged within the South after 1870 and after the Civil War, when the Southern prisons were obliterated due to the war, the overwhelming majority of women in those camps were African American. If there were any Caucasian offenders, a lot of times, if they even had more serious offenses, they were going to be housed in better places under better conditions. What we found through censuses is that in southern states such as Alabama, Louisiana, and so forth had about 37% of their African American women were used as leased out convicts. If you remember from our history lesson back in chapter 1, a leased out convict system meant that they could send their offenders out to work for profit. And they very rarely sent Caucasian offenders, female offenders, out to do any of that. We need to be able to acknowledge the disparity for a couple of reasons. Most research has never done that. And we need to understand that disparity and overrepresentation is not a new concept. It's been going on since the beginning of our incarceration philosophies. And it continues to this day. Female offenders have not and still not are cast in one mold. All our female offenders are as diverse as our society, and the experiences of the minority women that we come in contact with are going to be more terrifying, horrendous, and noxious than for Caucasian women because of the history that they have within our system. We also have to understand that all women and all female offenders have been demonized throughout history because of the social standing they have been expected to have throughout history. And if they happen to be female and another minority, then the impact is going to be that much worse. And so we have that double dynamic that makes it important for us as officers and researchers to take into consideration what that means and how that's going to impact the female offender experience within our facilities, and how that's going to impact not only the female inmate subculture, but the female officer subculture as well. About the same time we had our reformatory era within our prison systems and our correctional systems, which is about the 1870s, we also started to see the idea for reformatories for women become part of the conversation. These reformatories were developed as alternatives to the penitentiaries that had been developed between the early 1800s and the 1850s, such as penitentiaries for men had been. And so we look at the fact that reformatories were developed due to the efforts of women such as Elizabeth Fry, who appeared and wanted to have more influence to move these female offenders in reformatories and have a better chance at treatment, programming, and reform to make sure that they had also the same types of opportunities that the men were going to be given. Now keep in mind, reformatories in their earliest ideals were meant for younger offenders and did not come into the adult male population until much later. Female reformatories were going to be used to provide female in order to make them less vulnerable to physical and sexual abuse. Female reformatories were intended to be more humane and were supposed to be better than traditional female penitentiaries. Reformatories were overwhelmingly institutions, again, for Caucasian women. Fewer minorities were ever placed in these facilities, not because they were sentenced less frequently, but because minority women were less likely to be placed there by their sentencing judges due to racial discrimination. There was no emphasis to have institutions that were devoted to correcting quote-unquote moral offenses. More than half of the women that were imprisoned were there because of sexual misconduct. Use whatever imagination you need for this definition. But back during the Victorian era and into the early 20th century, women were incarcerated in reformatories primarily for what we today consider public order offenses. Lewd and lascivious carriage. Can you define that? I can't. Stubbornness. I think we all would be imprisoned for that. Idle and disorderly conduct. Drunkenness. Vagrancy. Fornication. Serial premarital pregnancies could get you into a reformatory back in the early 1900s. Keeping bad company. How about adultery? But I'll bet the man wasn't. You could even be imprisoned in a reformatory for having venereal disease. A lot of times, what it was putting females in a correctional facility, whether a reformatory or, if you were a minority, a penitentiary, for acting in an amoral or immoral way that was not expected of a woman of proper means or a woman of proper stature. Feminist criminologists are starting to research and understand that reformatories were institutions of what we call today patriarchy, which is male-oriented and male-dominated social structure that makes sure men see women in subservient positions and gives them all the economic, political, legal, and social power. And because of that, they were able to exercise the power over how prisons, including reformatories, were operated. Most of the reformatories that were operated for women at this time used indeterminate sentencing, but not because they wanted some treatment, because they could determine that if a woman in a reformatory would become more ladylike, she would then be released. The length of time that she served had little to do with the offense that she committed or the likelihood that she would commit future crimes, but the likelihood that she would meet the expectations of the system in which she lived. Now let's take a look at what we're dealing with in our modern day female offender population. As we look at our modern day 21st century female population, most are minority members and have very few options and limited economic resources. What does this mean? It means that most of the offenders that we are going to come in contact with, that I came in contact with during my career, are those females that come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. They grew up that way. They became that way. They have drug issues, which we'll talk about in later slides. And they have limited options to what they can do to remove themselves from these situations. Most of the women that are incarcerated, almost half have not graduated high school or have any sort of GED. Almost 2/3 didn't have a job when the time they were brought into the facility. Most of them have minor children. Almost 3/4 of them have minor children under the age of 18. And therefore, they are most likely to have been convicted of crimes involving drugs or property. Because what they're doing is trying to find a way to take care of their families, provide for their children, or feed their drug habit. Many of the women that are in our current facilities have faced sexual abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence, either in their childhood or what has continued through their entire life. And most of the women, over half, come into our criminal justice system marginalized by race, class, and gender. I talked in previous lectures of our prison and our correctional system being overrepresented by minorities. As a whole, African Americans in our prison systems make up over 40% of our prison population, and yet only make up 14% of our general nation's population. As far as female African American populations, they almost double that of what is Caucasian within our female prison populations, and are 3.1 times more likely to be in prison than whites, and 2.2 times more likely than Latinas to be in our prisons. And what we have to understand and hopefully empathize, not sympathize, but empathize with when we get into our careers is that it's this class of offenders that most typically are going to influence the next possible generations. Why? Because they make up a significant percentage of mothers who will be influencing children who are growing up to decide where they are going to be in this world. And it is a never-ending cycle. We talked about the prison subculture among the inmates in Chapter 9 in our last lecture that you just listened to. Now we're going to get into what a female inmate subculture is and how significantly different that is from our male inmate subculture. The conditioning of female inmates or women within our United States is one of traditional social roles. And when it comes to those that are within our prison walls, it's forced separation from their family during this incarceration. So a significant aspect of our female offenders being able to cope inside the prisons is for them to develop what we call family-like or faux family, pseudo-family-like environments. The fictional family or kin-like structures that they try and create during their time in these facilities are caring and nurturing environments. It's a family atmosphere that helps them for a couple of reasons. Number one, women are inherently nurturers. And so rather than send that inward and try and cope and become unable to deal with the fact that we have no place to use all of those nurturing feelings, they outwardly seek out the family structure. A lot of them are formed as friendships and companions, kind of a sister-sister, mother-daughter. Some of them will develop into sexual relationships. Just as in male prisons, the sexual relationships among female offenders do exist and are not uncommon. But as far as the difference in the mentality behind it, men do it for power, for control, and women do it sometimes for power and control, but a lot of times for that need for companionship and love. It's still not allowed, but that's the drive behind it. Old research showed that these types of relationships were along traditional male-female lines, but now what we find is with these faux families or pseudo-families, what we are finding is that it is meant for companionship, and although it can be really complicated, for this particular lecture, sexuality inside prison is separate from sexual identity, and it's meant to help with how the subculture works and how a person copes with what's going on inside prison. Mostly, all females return to traditional heterosexual roles. And regardless of what ties they made while they are in prison, they will return to what they knew once they get outside. And so we need to understand that a lot of what has been portrayed in the media, through TV, through movies, through, we find that they fulfill the roles they need in order to feel loved. But there are instances where these pseudo-families are meant to help with coping. And I'm going to include a video that I encourage you to watch. It's not, you're not going to be tested on it, But to get a better understanding of what these pseudo-families are and how significant they are with people, not only for those that seek power, but for those that seek protection and those that seek love and caring, what one of these operate under. The video will be more help in letting you see just what it entails. The idea of domestic violence is one that we have talked about before, one we'll continue to talk about briefly. Domestic violence has a high impact on women. By definition, at least by your author in this book, it is behaviors that are used by one person in relationship to control the other. Its impact on our female population, it goes beyond what we can absolutely discuss. But what we need to understand is how it affects our female offenders. Female offenders that are within our facilities are much more likely to have histories of physical abuse. They are more likely to report that they have been subjected to the most violence between the ages of 15 and 24, which is in conjunction with when they start to become involved in serious relationships with men. And it also tends to follow female offenders throughout their lifespan. What this kind of means is that offenders will continue to return to a lifestyle that is self-damaging. Why? Because they have started to see what this life is, but because of either risky behaviors, low self-esteem, an inability to take care of themselves, they are going to go back to a life that, although they understand is damaging to them, they also understand the person most likely can take care of them, and so they are trapped. Women who are on probation or parole are likely to be socially isolated from common social circles, and so therefore they don't have a network of people around them who are going to be able to help them, and it severely limits their ability to get those skills that are going to help them leave the situation that gets them into this situation to begin with. So women will continue to associate with whoever they have been originally around, which are going to be criminal offenders themselves. So as far as domestic violence are concerned, it tends to still be one of those things that drives the female offender into continued criminality, and therefore will continue to be one of the main reasons they not only are going to be hurt, but end up back in our facilities. When it comes to physical and sexual abuse, female offenders are better self-reporters. They will be much more apt to tell screeners and counselors that they have been either physically or sexually abused throughout their lifetime. Male offenders tend to not be forthcoming when it comes to that, mostly because of how it makes them look. It makes them look weak. It makes them look like a victim, and therefore they can't really get much respect within their social circles. State prison inmates have found that over 55% of females have had some past abuse in their lives, whereas only about a little over 15% have reported it. So we need to kind of take that for what it's worth. I'm sure that the incidence of male physical assault is higher than that. They just won't report it. Males tend to be more mistreated as children, but females bring that into their adulthood. So they're mistreated both as adults and children. Both males and females, if they've been part of the foster care system, report that they have been mistreated. And so what we need to understand is, depending on the life that they came from, will dictate how extensive their abuse has been. If the offenders, both female and male, but mostly male, or mostly female, excuse me, will have a higher incidence of drug or alcohol abuse if they have experienced sexual abuse in their past. So they will have a higher incidence of substance abuse issues if their past exposes a high incidence of sexual abuse. So some of the things that will come out when dealing with female offenders within our facilities is the prevalence of physical sexual abuse and an understanding of how prevalent it was depending on their upbringing. We also see through our female population that the research we've been able to uncover shows the riskiness of which our female offenders live their lives and rely a lot of times for a number of reasons, and it's all causal. It's one thing that I want in this lecture for you to understand is a lot of the female offending is all causally related. They grew up in either an abusive household, they lived in foster homes where they were sexually assaulted, they start to use drugs. In order to feed that drug habit, they go into prostitution. The prostitution leads them to a pimp who is now going to physically and sexually abuse them. They start to use more drugs. They are going to prostitute themselves to make the money to feed the drug habit, which gets them beaten more often by their pimp. It's all causality. And because of this, they now have a risky behavior lifestyle that has led them into a sex industry and has made them more susceptible to sexually transmitted diseases. And while at the top of the list is going to be HIV/AIDS, that is not the only sexually transmitted disease out there. And what we have is a high risk of any communicable disease, which can be anything from a sexually transmitted disease such as chlamydia or syphilis to communicable diseases such as hepatitis C or hepatitis B or HIV/AIDS. And so that's what we as those working in female and with female offenders have to kind of grasp in dealing with female offenders, and what makes them a special offender class is this causality that they bring into our institutions. It's a domino effect of their lives that bring them to this point. And so the causal factors and the order are not necessarily clear, but it's sort of a puzzle that ends up getting put together. And why they do all of these things are not necessarily in an order, but they all end up being all causal factors that get the female offender to the area that they're at. Again, in a continuation of the previous slide, drugs are going to be a major contributor to female criminality, and the fact that they use drugs more often than male offenders, not by a extreme difference, but a quarter of females serving time in our state prisons have been convicted of a drug offense, which is higher than men, but that when we deal with the female offenders, their drug use is one thing we want to kind of center on to try and keep them from recidivating, because if we can tackle the drug use and their substance abuse, we can start to look at the underlying reason. A lot of female offenders are substance abusers for self-medication purposes. For whatever reason, it's to get them through their prostitution. It's to get them through whatever it is that's causing their riskier behavior and the habits that they have. And therefore, if we can get them into recovery, we can get them into a lifestyle where they can look to the skills that they'll need to not have to rely on the life that they have. It sounds simplistic, but it's not, because a lot of times what's happening is what's causing their substance abuse is deep-seated into childhood victimization and serious thoughts of suicide and other mental distress, which means we're dealing with deep deep-seated issues that substance abuse has been trying to self-medicate for years. And so the treatment programs that are often offered within our institutions are just the tip of the iceberg. But if we can try and help with that, then maybe there are avenues to help them get to that early victimization and deal with that and help them to cope. And so drugs are a major contributor to female criminality, and one that needs to be dealt with at the root cause rather than as a top type of treatment to see about trying to help them. We talked about violent crime, and in proportion to male and female offenders, what we find is there is a huge disparity between the male and female offenders. Female offenders do not commit violent offenses with great frequency. It is bottom of the list when it comes to, if you were to look at a pie chart, the smallest sliver would be female offenders committing violent crimes. Most of the crimes revolve around property crimes or drug crimes. And of the women that do commit homicides, it goes back to what was similar to in the 19th and early 20th century. They kill those closest to them, what they call intimates, either in self-defense or in retaliation for long-term abusive relationships. Those haven't changed. If you have the few females that are out there that have that violent streak in them, they are probably similar to the female criminals that were outside of the social norm back in the Victorian era. Female chronic offenders are going to be similar to male chronic offenders in that they typically are going to be a minority, single, substance abuser, and have a history of spousal abuse. When female offenders do commit violent crimes, it's going to be family members, acquaintances, or those that they know very, very intimately. Those that kill an acquaintance, over 30%. A spouse, almost 30%. Stranger victims, somebody who preys on somebody they don't know, are not even 10%. And so given the high rates of abuse that we have within the female offending population, the female offender who is put in the system is known as a victim turned offender. And if you take my 251 class, which is correctional clients, we are going to talk about this a whole lot more, because that is an actual offender class and how we explain how female offenders get to be such a large portion of the population when they are convicted of our violent crimes. Most crimes against women are committed by male perpetrators. Second, women can only tend to attack men who they have been victimized by, and women commit far fewer crimes that are about power and control. And so while we look at the concepts that we've talked about earlier, about the chivalry hypothesis and how feminists have thought on criminality, and prior victimization on female offenders have been the primary causal factor on why females commit the crimes they do, we have to look at the fact that most crimes against women are committed by males. Women tend to only attack men who have victimized them, and women commit far fewer crimes that are about power and control. And so when we look at violent crime, we look at the fact that women do what is necessary because of their standing in society. And that is part patriarchy and part chivalry. And so as we start to see some of that change, we probably will see some of that as far as our research goes into why women commit the crimes they do. Now, when we look at in other classes and in our correctional institutions class on why women are being sentenced to much longer terms, we can look at some of the changes in the modern criminal justice era that will explain that. But in this explanation, we cannot look to the same reasons that men have been giving over the years. Women do not commit violent crime, at least not in the same percentages that men do. And so we have to kind of continue to look back at what we've talked about in these previous slides as to the reasoning behind, and it goes back to this prior victimization and why there is a huge disparity. One thing we also find with females is that they are much more likely to have mental health issues. Now, a lot of times with mental health issues, they are going to be tied to the stages in their life cycle. But being in prison can bring forth the prevalence and or the severity of mental illness. Being in prison can deteriorate these existing mental conditions and can lead to a further breakdown in their mental health. Mental health issues for female offenders depend on where they are. If you have a stunted puberty or adolescence, then how well you are going to adjust to being inside a facility will affect that. Also remember, because many of our female offenders have been physically and sexually abused, a lot of attention is going to have to be directed at things such as depression, anxiety, and other psychological illnesses that might not be as prevalent in the male offender population. What you'll see most in our male population are going to be mental illnesses such as schizophrenia, which is very prominent between the ages of 17 and 25 in the male population. You will see antisocial disorder. You will see schizoaffective disorder. You will see bipolar. Within the female population, you will see much more depression, much more anxiety. You will also see PTSD because of the physical and sexual abuse that a lot of our female offender population has experienced, not only in their childhood, but in their adult relationships due to domestic violence and or continued sexual abuse. And so keep in mind that these common symptoms are going to be developing largely in response to stressors. And for those of you that know anything about PTSD, you're going to realize that a lot of the stressors are going to come out because of the isolation and the subculture that provides that isolation within our facilities and jails. And with them within our facilities, we're going to find that they are much more vocal about how they're feeling, and they're going to let us know when they're feeling this way. Now, the socialization in the prison subculture within the female offender class is also going to help them with their expression of being sad and emotional. That's going to be to our advantage as correctional staff, because it's going to allow us to be able to identify when a female inmate is having some issues. It makes it less so with the male population. So mental health issues is something that we need to be able to identify and be able to understand the ones that are going to manifest themselves through the early traumas that were experienced by the female offenders in childhood as well as early adulthood, and that are showing themselves in depression, anxiety, and PTSD. As mentioned earlier, many of our female offenders are single mothers of dependent children. If a female offender comes into our facilities and they are single mothers with underage children, they are facing losing custody of those children. 1.3 million children have mothers who are in our system at this time. With facing losing custody of their children also is the uncertainty of who's going to care for the children while they are incarcerated. Now, many times, the mothers of the female offenders can take care of the children while the females are incarcerated. However, if those maternal grandmothers are unable or unwilling to take those grandchildren, then most likely what's going to happen is they're going to go into the foster care system. And when that happens, then what the female offender is likely to face is a number of obstacles put in place by the foster care system and the state system of reuniting with the children when they are released from the facility. In order for female offenders to maintain contact with their children, it is important for the children to have access to that child. The situation to do that is highly difficult to do because there are fewer women's prisons within the state's prison systems, and therefore they tend to be great distances from the offenders' homes. This means that it's going to take more of an effort for the children to travel to see their mothers, and a lot of times if they are with the maternal grandparents, they can't afford nor can they experience the travel distance to those women's prisons. This is going to lead to a lower rate of contact the child has to the mother, which is going to ultimately weaken the family bonds. What this is going to do is weaken the resolve of the female offender, which will lead to recidivism rates because the mothers have diminished contact with the children. The separation that results because of this is called collateral damage. Collateral damage is known as any damage that is incidental to an activity, in this case the fact that the female offender is in a facility and that the child can no longer maintain contact due to incidents that are beyond their capability. What we need to understand is that the damage done to the children is probably more serious than to the adult, because during these nurturing years they no longer have a mother and sometimes not even a member of the family to help them grow up. This will result in the number of children that can display symptoms of PSD or other negative effects, which then puts them in the cycle of doing exactly what their parents before them have done. There have been a few legal cases and few decisions that have been decided regarding the conditions of care for female offenders within our institutions. It's always been considered general knowledge that most female prisons institutions don't meet the inmates' needs as effectively as male prisons. The Glover v. Johnson decision in '88 was the deciding case that showed to the poor services that tended to be delivered to female inmates. And wouldn't you know, it's a case out of Michigan. It involved the issue of parity in how programming was being distributed to inmates within the state of Michigan. It alleged that the constitutional rights of female inmates were violated because inmates were being denied educational and vocational rehabilitation opportunities that the male inmates were actually being given. MDOC was found liable and had to issue a decree that provided female inmates with 2-year college programming, paralegal training, and access to an attorney in order to make sure that their law library facilities were made adequate, revisions to the wage policy to make sure that they were making the same as the men, access to programming that had been previously denied, and prison industries that previously had existed only at male facilities. Even though Michigan had done this, there are and appears to be little improvement across the rest of the states. And what we're finding is what is considered more than just benign neglect, which is neglect upon the administrations of prisons across the United States, that they just don't pay attention to the fact that women don't have the same opportunities as their male counterparts because they are such an insignificant percentage of their total population. And so what we're finding is more and more questions are coming forth, making sure that conditions are going to be in parity with those of the male inmate population. To improve the services for inmate female offenders, we first need to acknowledge that we have gender differences throughout the criminal justice system. And we need to have it dominated by the rule of parity, which is equal treatment to be provided to everyone. What it doesn't mean is that the exact same treatment is appropriate for both men and women. So we need to come up and have data that shows what is clearly concerning and what is distinguishing female and male offenders. Female offenders come into the criminal justice system via different pathways, and therefore we need to understand that they're going to respond to supervision and custody differently. They're going to exhibit differences in terms of substance abuse, trauma, mental illness, parenting responsibilities, all of that stuff. And they are going to represent different levels of risk. So in order for us to successfully develop and deliver services, supervision, and treatment for female offenders, there has to be an acknowledgement that there is those gender differences. Because of the lower levels of violent crime and the low risk to public safety, female offenders absolutely should have a lower minimal restriction to meet the public safety interests. So we need to understand why women commit crimes, the impact of the interpersonal violence on their lives, and understand the environmental context that is needed for the programming. Issues crucial to the promotion of successful outcomes and understanding their response to substance abuse, trauma, and mental health are three critical areas in order to help us maintain the female offender experience, not only in incarceration, but community corrections and reentry back into the community. We also should have programs that will address both the social and material realities of female offenders, which means we need to pay attention to their socioeconomic status, how they have dealt with their experience with trauma, as well as their relationships with not only their partners, but with their children and their families. If we can understand the role of where they are as a gender, then we can start to come up with programming that is specific to their gender and be able to deal and come up with how to help them in their stays in wherever part of the criminal justice system they are. In the last lecture, we talked a little about the Prison Rape Elimination Act. We're going to talk a little bit more about it in that it applies more so to females than males, but we have to understand that it encompasses all inmates within our facility purview. This act was passed in 2003. It estimates the prevalence of all acts, not just assault, but harassment, as well as consensual, as well as forced. We're talking about jails, prisons, juvenile facilities, military and Native American tribal facilities, immigrations and custom enforcement facilities. It is violent victimization and potential reluctance we have to take into consideration. What we need to be concerned with is anything related to sexual assault, both of inmate on inmate, as well as sexual misconduct between inmate and staff. Most of the sexual assault is on women behind bars, and it is at the hands of custodial staff. What we need to be aware of is that most of the sexual misconduct is female correctional staff with male inmates. And the law distinguishes the fact that male inmates cannot give consent while they are in an institution. And so they are still considered to be under the control of a female corrections officer. And so it is more prevalent for female corrections staff to be charged with sexual misconduct with a male inmate, although we hear more of the male corrections officers taking advantage of female inmates. Prisons have to be on alert that in male institutions, male inmates are assaulted by male prison staff. It happens. And therefore, we need to be aware of the variations that happen no matter what the institution is, no matter who the inmate is, no matter who is doing the assaulting, whether it's inmate or staff member. And so that is what the Prison Rape Elimination Act is and why we have to pay attention to it. Many female offenders can be viewed as special needs plus. What this means is they have a myriad of issues and they need specific recommendations regarding treatment. So what we need to do is make sure we have treatment plans that are individualized, that have clear and measurable goals. Intensive programming that have an effective duration, which means they last for a long time, and have screening and assessment that is appropriate. We need to have treatment programs that allow female offenders to acquire the needed life skills that include parenting, anger management, and marketable job skills. And last, we have to have programming that addresses victimization, that address self-esteem and domestic violence issues. We also need to have programming out there that is dealing with physical health care, adult sexuality, preventive pregnancy education, and can give them education on sexually transmitted diseases. That focuses on women's strengths, acknowledges their role as a parent, improves their interactions between their children and them, and provides comprehensive, coordinated services for them and their children. This is what we need. And this is why we have to have gender-specific treatment for female offenders with co-occurring disorders, which is mental illness as well as substance abuse. This will help treat these specific female offenders that are now considered special needs offenders to get the help that is specific for them in order to help them gain the treatment and programming that they need while they are incarcerated or in the community. In this lecture, we concentrated solely on female offenders behind bars. We talked about some of the characteristics of female offenders and looked at the rates of incarceration and how the sentencing between male and female offenders was significantly different. We looked at the history of corrections in relation to female offenders, talking about Elizabeth Fry and her dedication to getting a separation of female inmates and the male inmate population. We looked at some of the issues associated with modern-day female offenders and how substance abuse, as well as their history as far as domestic violence and substance abuse, affected what they brought into the correctional facility. We looked at some of the considerations associated with effective correctional operations and the legal issues, and specifically the Glover case and how they are to be treated within correctional facilities. And we looked at various treatment implications, specifically gender-based treatment programming, to help deal with female offenders within our facilities. Your discussion question for this week is just one. It is, what would you do on page 318, 319? Make sure that you read it fully and make sure that you put yourself in the role of the correctional officer. Use the concepts within this chapter and any other chapter that we have covered so far to give a complete answer of no less than 300 words. When you're done, dialogue with another one of your classmates on how they answered the question and how you differed or were similar in how you did. Thank you for your attention on two of our probably most important lectures that we have. Come back next week when we talk about our next important lecture, that of our immigration system and how that influences our correctional system. Thank you, and we'll talk to you next time.